We like to think of science as this noble quest for truth, right? A journey for knowledge. But what happens when that quest completely loses its moral compass? Today, we're diving into some of the darkest moments in history, when the pursuit of discovery turned into an excuse for pure cruelty.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. It's a tough one. Where is that line? At what point does the ambition for a breakthrough become a straight-up crime against our fellow human beings?
Now you might think this is a modern problem, something that came about with modern warfare or technology. But no, to start, we have to go way, way back, over 2,000 years ago to the city of Alexandria. Back then, it was the intellectual center of the world. So picture this. It's the 4th century BC. A brilliant Greek doctor named Herophilus shows up in Alexandria. He's drawn to the city's legendary library, and he has one goal: to figure out, once and for all, how the human body actually works. But he wasn't going to just theorize about it. He was determined to see it with his own eyes. To do this, he used a practice called vivisection. And as you can see, that means operating on live subjects. But here's the twist. His subjects weren't animals. The ruler of Alexandria gave him condemned criminals to work on, and yes, they were operated on while they were still alive.
The things he did, it's brutal. Remember, there were no anesthetics. His victims felt every single incision. He would dissect their organs, perform surgeries on their eyes, and even intentionally sever nerves just to see what kind of paralysis it would cause. These weren't quiet, private studies either. Sometimes he'd perform these vivisections in public for anyone who was curious enough to watch.
He made some incredible discoveries, no doubt about it. But his methods were so unbelievably shocking that the practice of human dissection was outlawed right after he died. And that ban stuck. The revulsion was so strong that it took almost 2,000 years, 1,800 years, before dissection was considered medically acceptable again, and even then, only on people who were already deceased.
Okay, let's jump way forward in time. We're in the 20th century now, and science is no longer just about pure discovery, it's being weaponized. It's a tool for political control.
So in 1921, the Soviet Secret Service set up a secret lab. They called it the Camera, or the Chamber. Its mission was terrifyingly simple: create the perfect poison, one that was deadly, had no taste, no smell, and was totally untraceable in an autopsy. And for their test subjects, they used prisoners from the gulags.
The way they did it was just chillingly methodical. They'd take a prisoner, tell them they were getting some kind of medicine, and then give them a dose of something like ricin or cyanide. Then the scientists would just watch. They'd observe the agonizing effects, taking detailed notes, all so they could perfect their chemical weapons.
And you know what? They succeeded. Their big breakthrough was a poison called C2. And the result, as this quote shows, was just insidious. It didn't cause a big, violent scene. The victim would just quietly get weaker and weaker and then die within about 15 minutes. It was the perfect assassination tool for a government that wanted its enemies to just vanish. But it would be a huge mistake to think this kind of state-sponsored abuse was only happening in places like the Soviet Union. The United States has its own dark history of secret experiments, very often targeting vulnerable people in other countries.
And here are two really shocking examples. On one hand, you have Project 4.1, where people from the Marshall Islands were basically treated like living test subjects for studying nuclear fallout. And on the other, you've got this experiment in Guatemala where American doctors deliberately infected more than 1,000 people with STDs just to see if penicillin worked. In both of these cases, people were used as human guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent.
Let's just focus on Project 4.1 for a second. This all kicked off after the Castle Bravo nuclear test in 1954, a blast 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. When the US government failed to evacuate people in time, they just pivoted. They turned this horrific disaster into a long-term experiment, and the effects have been generational. We're talking widespread cancer, birth defects, tumors. The human cost is just staggering.
And then you have the Guatemalan study, where the cruelty was so incredibly personal and deliberate. Just look at this quote, which describes the final days of a patient named Bertha. She was already dying from the syphilis they'd given her, and the lead doctor, John Cutler, decided to infect her again, even putting pus directly into her eyes. She died a few days later. This goes so far beyond observation. It's just torture masquerading as science.
Okay, we've covered some truly awful things, but now
Now we have to talk about what is widely considered one of the most depraved, horrifying chapters in the entire history of science, Imperial Japan's Unit 731 during World War II.
To even begin to understand the mindset here, you only need to know one word, Maruta. It means logs in Japanese, and that was the code name for all the prisoners, men, women, and even children. The whole facility was disguised as a lumber mill, so think about that. This wasn't just a code name, it was a philosophy. They completely dehumanized their victims, seeing them as nothing more than raw material to be experimented on.
So you have to ask, why? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, some of it was for biological weapons development, but a lot of it was for something much more disturbing. This testimony from a professor who was there says it all. A lot of it was just morbid professional curiosity, or in his own words, they were just playing around. This wasn't science. It was sadism with a lab coat.
And this playing around included things that are almost impossible to even imagine. Live dissections with no anesthesia, freezing people's limbs and then watching them thaw, putting people in pressure chambers until their eyes literally popped out. They would dehydrate people to death just to see what would happen. They even forcibly impregnated women, infected them with diseases, and then cut out the fetuses to study the effects. The scale of the cruelty is just, it's beyond comprehension.
So, what happens when the war ends? As Soviet troops got close, the Japanese destroyed the evidence, burned the facility, and killed all the remaining prisoners. But that's not where the story ends. The aftermath, in some ways, is just as disturbing.
When the United States learned the full, horrifying truth about Unit 731, they were faced with a moral crisis. They saw all this research, data on frostbite, on how diseases progress, on how the human body reacts to extreme trauma, and they saw it as scientifically priceless. After all, this was data you could never get through ethical research.
And the decision they made was a truly dark bargain. In exchange for all of the data from Unit 731, the United States secretly gave full immunity from war crimes prosecution to the very scientists who had committed these atrocities. You can see the two very different approaches here. The US decided the data was too important to lose, so they let the perpetrators walk free. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, captured some of the Unit 731 staff and actually put them on trial, sentencing 12 of them to labor camps. It was a clear fork in the road, knowledge versus justice.
Which brings us right back to our original question, but maybe with a bit more weight. What is the true price of knowledge? And more importantly, who is forced to pay that price? Across all these stories, from ancient Egypt to the battlefields of World War II, the answer is always the same. The bill was never paid by the scientists or the governments. It was paid by the powerless, the forgotten, and the unwilling. And that's a legacy that we still have to wrestle with today.